Peppa Pig, the new friend. One sunny morning, Peppa and George were playing in the garden when a strange piglet approached them. He had pale gray skin, odd eyes with a reddish tint, and a quiet, muffled voice. "Hi, I'm Simon," he said with a smile. "Hi, Simon." "Do you want to play with us?" Peppa asked cheerfully. Simon nodded, but his smile seemed a little off to Peppa. George also looked uneasy, but they decided Simon was just their new friend. At first, they played harmless games. Simon suggested hide and seek, but chose the strangest hiding places, like behind the trees where no one ever hid. When George tried to find him, he suddenly heard a whisper behind him, even though Simon should have been far away. "It's just a game," Simon said, stepping out from the shadows. By evening, things got even stranger. Simon asked to stay for dinner, and Mummy Pig invited him to join. "Are you from the next village?" Mummy Pig asked. "I'm from far away," Simon replied quietly, not taking his eyes off his plate. During dinner, he hardly ate, and instead stared at everyone, especially Peppa. After the family went to bed, Peppa noticed Simon still standing in the garden, staring at the house. The next day, Simon came back. He started inviting Peppa and George to play unsettling games. One game was called Look into the Dark. Simon led them into a dark corner of the shed and said, "Look closely. You'll see something interesting." But instead of something fun, Peppa felt a chilling cold, and Simon's shadow in the darkness seemed to move on its own. One evening, Peppa heard whispering outside her bedroom door. She cautiously peeked out and saw Simon standing in the hallway. His eyes were now glowing red. "Peppa, come with me. We'll be best friends forever," he whispered. Terrified, Peppa called for her parents, but when they arrived, Simon was gone. The next day, George disappeared. All they found was his toy dinosaur, abandoned in the garden. Simon appeared again and said, "Don't worry, he's with me. He's happy." Peppa realized Simon wasn't a friend, but something far more sinister. She tried to make him leave, but he just smiled and said, "You're next." Peppa Pig. Mom is no longer the same. The day was gray and rainy. The clouds hung low over the pig family's house, the wind shook the trees, and raindrops drummed against the windows. Daddy Pig had gone out on business, and Mummy Pig went shopping, leaving Peppa and George at home. They played in the living room, building towers out of blocks, but something felt off. The house seemed quieter than usual, as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting for something. Time dragged on. It was getting dark outside, but Mummy Pig still hadn't returned. Then the lock clicked. The children jumped. The door slowly creaked open. Mummy Pig stepped inside. But something was wrong. Her movements were slow, uneven, as if her body had forgotten how to move. Her wet clothes clung to her skin, but she didn't shake off the rain, didn't take off her boots, didn't say a word. She just stood there, unblinking, staring at the children. The living room grew cold. The air thickened with a strange heaviness, like the moment before a storm. Peppa squeezed George's hand. Mummy Pig's eyes weren't the same. The whites had turned too pale, almost gray, and her pupils had dilated so much that her eyes looked like two black voids. But the most terrifying thing was her mouth. It hung slightly open. Her lips twitched as if she was trying to say something but couldn't. Peppa waited for Mummy to speak, but she just stood there. Then she stepped forward. The floorboards didn't creak. It was as if her feet weren't touching the ground at all. The lights in the room flickered as though the air had thickened, turning heavier. Mummy Pig moved again. But now her movements became unnatural, fluid, like a puppet suspended on strings. Her head tilted slowly, and in the dim light, Peppa noticed something strange. Something was moving beneath her skin. Dark shapes slithered under the surface of her face, as if hundreds of tiny creatures were living inside. Peppa shivered, but the worst came in the next moment. Mummy Pig lunged forward, suddenly like a broken doll. Her whole body jerked forward and her mouth stretched open wider than should be possible. Peppa heard a sound for the first time. Not a voice, not a whisper, but a chorus of hundreds of voices speaking at once. The house shuddered. The curtains twisted with writhing shadows, the walls cracked, and from the gaps in the floorboards, a black liquid seeped out. Mummy Pig rose above the ground. Her arms elongated, her fingers became too thin, and from her mouth something slipped out, black, writhing, alive. The shadows in the room folded into a single mass and swarmed forward. Peppa screamed, but there was no sound. All she could hear were footsteps coming closer, the footsteps of something that was no longer Mummy Pig. This episode of the animated series Peppa Pig has never been shown on TV.
Peppa Pig, Eyes in the Dark. In the Pig family's house, an unusual silence reigned. Lately, George had hardly spoken to his sister. He no longer played with his dinosaur, didn't ask for bedtime stories, and didn't laugh the way he used to. Instead, he spent long hours sitting at the table by the window, clutching a pencil. Sheets of paper were scattered everywhere, on the floor, on the chair, even by the bed. All of them were covered with the same strange symbols, circles with short lines, resembling eyes. "George, what are these drawings?" Peppa asked cautiously. Her brother slowly turned to her. His gaze was unusual, heavy, and somehow too grown up. "You'll find out soon," he whispered, and bent over the papers again. Peppa felt her little hooves grow cold. George was becoming more and more withdrawn, as if his attention was fixed on something she couldn't see. One night, when they were both already lying in their beds, Peppa noticed that George wasn't asleep. He sat right on his sheets, staring at the ceiling. His eyes shimmered strangely, reflecting the moonlight. But there was no warmth in that gleam. It felt as if a bottomless depth was hiding inside them, one she could fall into. "George," Peppa whispered. He didn't answer. He only smiled, in a way he had never smiled before. The next morning, George's bed was empty. His favorite dinosaur lay torn to pieces on the floor. Above his pillow, on the wall, scratches had appeared. Symbols like eyes, as if someone had carved them with a sharp claw. "George!" Peppa called. But the room remained silent. She rushed through the house, searching for her brother in the garden, the kitchen, the living room. But George was nowhere. Everything around her felt too quiet, as if time itself had stopped. When Peppa returned to their room, her eyes fell on the large mirror hanging on the wall. Her heart froze. In the reflection behind her stood George. She spun around quickly. No one was there. But in the mirror, he remained, staring. His eyes glowed with a dim, sickly light, and his lips stretched into a smile. Peppa backed away, and then she noticed that next to George in the reflection sat Labubu. The toy looked almost the same as always, but its eyes flickered with a red glow. On its face lingered the same eerie smile as George's. "George is no more," came a strange voice from the mirror. It was low, drawn out, and echoed both in the room and inside her head. Peppa pressed herself to the wall. The surface of the mirror rippled like water. The shapes of George and Labubu moved forward, toward the glass. Their outlines became sharper, as if they were about to break through. "No!" Peppa screamed. She dashed toward the door, but suddenly froze. In the mirror, her own bed reflected as empty. And on it sat Labubu, very close now, with glowing eyes and a crooked smile. The mirror trembled, and the shadows nearly tore their way out. Peppa squeezed her eyes shut, unable to look. When she opened them again, the mirror was ordinary. The room was silent. Only George's bed remained empty. Later that night, when their parents had gone to sleep, Peppa sat on her bed, staring at the shelf where Labubu now stood again. He looked harmless, soft and familiar. But now she knew the truth. His eyes were no longer lifeless buttons. In their dim glow flickered the same cold emptiness she had seen in George, and in the corner of the room, near the mirror, a crack was slowly spreading. It widened as if something unseen was watching from behind the wall. One evening, when the usual quiet filled Peppa Pig's house, Peppa noticed something strange in her room. On the carpet, right by her bed, lay a small yellow toy. It looked like a little creature with huge black eyes and a wide smile, too straight and motionless to be friendly. "George, look!" Peppa said, picking up the toy. "We've never had this one before." George shrugged. "Maybe it's your new toy." But Peppa was certain she had never seen it before. The toy was light but strangely cold, as if it wasn't made of fabric at all, but of something damp and alive. The next day, she noticed something even more disturbing. On the wall, directly across from her bed, a new window had appeared. It was narrow and tall. Beyond the glass stretched a thick forest full of fog, and among the trees moved dozens of little figures, all exactly like her toy. They stood motionless, staring straight into her room. "Mummy, look!" Peppa called. "There's a window, and the toy is smiling." But Mummy Pig saw nothing. To her, it was just a wall, and the toy wasn't there at all. "You've been playing too much, Peppa," Mummy said gently. "It's time for bed." That night, Peppa woke to a whisper. The toy was sitting on her pillow, quietly repeating, "We're waiting for you. Look through the window." Beyond the glass, the forest was alive. The creatures moved closer, and there were even more of them now. All of them whispered in one voice, "Join us!" Each night, Peppa woke to the same whisper. At first, it was only words. Then she noticed her skin turning a faint shade of yellow. George tried to tell their parents that his sister looked strange, but they only smiled, not seeing anything unusual. On the third night, Peppa's eyes began to darken. She stared into the mirror for a long time, watching as the whites turned grey, until finally they became two black circles. On the fourth night, there were even more creatures in the forest. Their ranks stretched between the trees, and all of them reached out thin hands toward the window. The whisper grew louder, their voices blending into a single chant. "Soon you will be one of us! They're my friends!" Peppa whispered to George. "Soon you'll see them too!" On the fifth night, her smile grew wider and froze on her face, just like the toys. George began to cry and ran to his parents, but they only patted his head. "It was just a dream," said Mummy Pig. By morning, when they returned to the room, Peppa looked normal again. The toy had vanished, but at night it always came back. The sixth night was the longest. Peppa sat by the window, speaking with the creatures. At first, she whispered. Then she spoke aloud. She repeated the words they taught her, words George didn't understand. The forest seemed to sway in rhythm with her voice, and the shadows appeared to move with her breath. On the seventh night, everything ended. Peppa stood by the window. Her skin was now fully yellow, her eyes black, her smile stretched so wide her face no longer looked like her own. The toy sat beside her, whispering, "The time has come." The creatures in the forest parted, opening a path. Peppa stepped toward the glass and vanished into it, as if it had turned to water. The room was empty. On the windowsill lay a small yellow toy. Now it whispered to Mummy Pig whenever she entered the room. A week passed. George was playing when he noticed a new toy lying on the floor, exactly the same as Peppa's. On the wall, another window had appeared. In its depths, shrouded in fog, stood Peppa. She was smiling her wide smile and calling to her brother. The cycle had begun again.
Peppa Pig, uncontrollable growth. It was an ordinary evening in the pig household. The sun was setting, casting warm rays through the windows of the living room. Peppa and George were sitting on the couch, flipping through a book of fairy tales their mother had given them. The atmosphere was calm, almost too perfect. But deep inside Peppa, a strange feeling began to build, as if something wasn't quite right. She put the book down and stretched, gazing out the window. The sky had turned darker, taking on a purple hue, and the first stars were beginning to appear. But as she stared at the darkening sky, she felt a strange sensation in her chest, as if her heart had skipped a beat. It felt like some sort of pressure, almost as if she felt uncomfortably full. Peppa stood up, rubbing her stomach. It felt like she had overeaten at dinner, but that wasn't the case. Her clothes started to feel tight. The sensation of pressure grew stronger, and she noticed something even stranger. She was growing. At first, it was only a little bit. Her legs tingled and her shoes started to feel tight, but she brushed it off as a trick of the mind. However, the strange feeling didn't go away. On the contrary, it only intensified. Her legs began to stretch. Peppa looked down in horror as her legs grew longer and her pants tightened around her body. She gasped, trying to call for her parents, but her voice sounded muffled, as though something was blocking it. And then she kept growing. Her legs stretched further and her body seemed to expand faster and faster. She could feel her arms and head elongating. She reached for the walls, but each movement made her grow even more. Peppa panicked, trying to steady herself, but with every step, she just got bigger. Soon she was taller than the house, and everything around her felt tighter. The ceiling cracked as her head scraped against it. The walls closed in around her, and Peppa couldn't comprehend what was happening. The world around her seemed so small. Even the floor, which had once felt solid, began to crack under her growing weight. With every step, Peppa became bigger, and it was harder and harder to control her body. Her movements were slow and clumsy, and she felt more out of control with each passing second. The furniture fell apart, the walls crumbled, and she couldn't stop growing. Everything around her felt smaller, and she felt like a giant moving through a tiny world. Peppa looked around in horror, trying to make sense of it all, but with each moment she felt more helpless. Her body, once light and agile, was now heavy and uncontrollable. She tried to crouch down, but her massive body didn't obey her. Her clothes and the walls around her squeezed in, and she continued to grow, unable to stop herself. As she was nearly bursting through the roof, she felt the house begin to collapse. The walls broke apart, and the ceiling flew off as if made of cards. Peppa stood there, her gigantic body blocking out everything. What was once her home was now destroyed and gone, crushed under the weight of her own growth. She sat in complete silence, surrounded by the ruins of the house, unable to understand how to return to her original size. Her body didn't obey her, and the world around her seemed too tiny and fragile.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. In the quiet of the night, Peppa was awakened by a strange scratching sound coming from inside her wardrobe. She tried to ignore it, pulling the covers tighter around her. But the scratching grew louder, more insistent. It was a rhythmic, deliberate sound, like claws on wood. A thin sliver of light appeared under the wardrobe door, pulsing with a sickly green glow. Peppa's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to call for Mummy and Daddy Pig, but her voice was caught in her throat. The wardrobe door creaked open, and a long, spindly shadow stretched across the floor, reaching for her bed. The air in the room grew cold, and the familiar, cheerful wallpaper seemed to peel away, revealing dark, damp stone beneath. The green light spilled out, casting dancing, distorted shadows on the walls. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl. Peppa could see two glowing red eyes in the darkness of the wardrobe, unblinking and malevolent. The shadow on the floor grew larger, taking the shape of a monstrous figure with long, sharp claws. The smell of damp earth and decay filled the room. The figure stepped out of the wardrobe, its form shifting and indistinct, a creature of nightmare. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, its red eyes fixed on Peppa. The familiar comfort of her bedroom had become a cage, and the monster was the keeper. The moonlight streaming through the window was swallowed by the encroaching darkness. The creature's growl rumbled through the room, a sound that vibrated in Peppa's very bones. It raised a clawed hand, its shadow falling over Peppa's bed. The world outside her window seemed to fade away, leaving only the suffocating darkness of the room and the terrifying presence of the monster. The last thing Peppa saw before she squeezed her eyes shut was the glint of sharp, white teeth in the monster's gaping maw.
It all began subtly. Peppa was the first to notice that her little brother George had changed. At first, it was just small things. He became quieter than usual, stopped laughing, and played less with his favorite dinosaur. He often sat on the floor by the window, tracing shapes on the carpet with his fingers. At first, Peppa thought it was just a game, but then she realized the shapes were always the same. Circles, and in the center of each, two long stretched eyes. "George, what are you drawing?" she asked, trying to peek closer. But he didn't answer. His gaze was empty, as if he wasn't looking at the drawings at all, but sinking somewhere deep inside himself. With each passing day, it grew worse. George stopped responding to her words, ate less and less, and at night, Peppa heard him whispering strange words in his sleep. Sometimes he would get up and stand motionless in the middle of the room, his eyes fixed on the darkness. One evening, he finally looked up at her, and Peppa's heart froze. His eyes were completely empty. The smile stretching across his face was unnatural, alien. "I'm not George anymore," he whispered in a low, hollow voice. One that didn't belong to her brother, but to someone older, someone else entirely. And after those words, he simply melted into the darkness. Peppa screamed, called for her parents, but they only said she must have had a nightmare. The next day, George returned. He sat at the table, eating porridge, as if nothing had happened. But when Peppa met his gaze, he leaned toward her and whispered, "You're next." On the floor lay his dinosaur, torn to pieces, threads sticking out, strange red marks on its body, as if clawed fingers had ripped through it. Peppa could no longer pretend nothing was happening. She noticed something else. In the hallway mirror, George's reflection lived its own life. When George himself sat still, the reflection turned its head and stared at her. Sometimes its lips moved, and one day, Peppa clearly heard, "He is already with us." No adult noticed anything. Mummy and Daddy said everything was fine, that George was healthy. But deep inside, Peppa felt it. Her brother was slipping away into somewhere else, and she was powerless to stop it. A few days later, he was gone for good. His bed was empty. On the pillow lay a piece of paper, the letters jagged and crooked. "He is with us now." Peppa clutched the note, her hands trembling. The house felt colder. The silence hung heavy and thick. That night, she awoke to a strange sound. From the bathroom came a droning murmur, but it wasn't water. It was a melody, faint, hollow, as if played on an old radio. Peppa tiptoed down the hallway, each step echoing loudly. She pushed the bathroom door open and froze. Something was crawling out of the toilet. Its body writhed, slick with slime. Its eyes glowed red, and mingled with the bubbling sound was a dreadful melody. The same haunting tune, repeating again and again. "Tralalelo, tralala." It seemed to sing, the sound spreading through the pipes, through the walls, straight into her head. Peppa gripped the doorframe, her whole body shaking. The creature was enormous, rising higher and higher, stretching its long arms toward her. Its head tilted to the side, moving slowly. and then it shook as if to say, "You can't run." Peppa's throat went dry. She tried to scream, but no voice came out. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. The thing slithered closer, its red eyes burning brighter, the melody swelling until it filled the entire house. Peppa stumbled back, step by step, until her back hit the wall. She knew this was connected to George, his disappearance, his words, the strange patterns on the floor. All of it led here. And then she saw him. On the shelf in the hallway sat Labubu, her favorite toy, always harmless before, but now his eyes glowed red and his smile was twisted. He didn't move, yet his gaze said clearly, "You're next." Peppa felt the cold seep inside her. She realized George had only been the first. Now it was her turn.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa was taking a bath, splashing happily in the bubbles. Suddenly, the water turned murky, then black, and the bubbles began to pop with a sinister hiss. She tried to get out, but her hands slipped on the porcelain, as if the tub itself was holding her captive. A pair of glowing red eyes emerged from the black water, followed by a shadowy, elongated figure. It reached out with a long skeletal hand, its fingers tipped with sharp, black claws. Pause 30 seconds. Peppa screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the gurgling of the drain, which had transformed into a gaping maw. The figure pulled her deeper into the black water, its cold embrace tightening around her. She could hear faint whispers coming from the water, calling her name, inviting her to join its watery grave. The bathroom grew colder, and the shadows danced around her, making the distorted figure seem to come alive. She closed her eyes, wishing it was all a dream, but the cold touch on her cheek told her it was terrifyingly real. Pause 30 seconds. When she opened them again, the water was clear, and the figure was gone, but her reflection in the mirror was not her own. It was the shadowy figure, its glowing red eyes staring back at her, a sinister smile on its face. She knew she was trapped. The house creaked and groaned around her, each sound a chilling reminder of the presence lurking within. She could hear faint whispers, carried on the wind, calling her name. The air grew heavy, and a strange, sweet smell filled the room, making her dizzy. She felt a cold touch on her ankle, and a shiver ran down her spine. Peppa knew she wasn't alone. Pause 30 seconds. The shadows in her room seemed to deepen, twisting into grotesque shapes. She could feel eyes watching her from every corner. The house was no longer a safe haven, but a trap. She pulled the covers over her head, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. She knew she had to escape, but where could she go? The house was alive and it wanted her. She could hear the floorboards groaning, the walls creaking, as if the house itself was closing in on her. The air was thick with an unseen presence, and she felt a suffocating weight on her chest. Peppa knew this was the end. The last thing she saw before darkness consumed her was her own reflection, now completely transformed, its glowing red eyes staring back at her. It was smiling, and then nothing, just the silence of the house, waiting for its next victim.
Peppa Pig. Something in the house. The evening at the Pig household was unusually quiet. Peppa and George played in the living room while rain tapped softly against the windows. The dim light flickered and a strange tension filled the air. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the trees like eerie whispers in the night. Shadows from the flickering television danced against the walls, elongating into strange, distorted shapes. Then the door creaked open. Peppa turned quickly, her heartbeat quickening. The door had been closed. She was sure of it. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig entered, but something was wrong. Their movements were too smooth, too silent, as if they glided rather than walked. Their eyes were empty, hollow voids, and their smiles were unnaturally wide, frozen in place like grotesque masks. The room grew cold. A chill seeped into Peppa's bones, numbing her fingertips. The air thickened, pressing against her chest as if the room itself were alive. George clutched his dinosaur tighter, his little fingers trembling. The silence between them stretched, heavy with unseen dread. Daddy Pig's head twisted at an impossible angle, his neck creaking and popping as he turned 180 degrees to stare at them. Mummy Pig's posture shifted unnaturally, her body bending too far forward, her arms dangling lifelessly at her sides like a broken puppet. Then came the sound. A rhythmic click-clack of hooves echoed through the hallways, slow and deliberate. The footsteps did not belong to anyone they knew. Peppa grabbed George's hand, her grip firm, and without hesitation they bolted upstairs. Their feet pounded against the wooden steps, the house groaning beneath them. Peppa reached their bedroom, yanked George inside, and slammed the door shut, twisting the lock with shaking fingers. Silence. The handle began to turn, softly at first, then with more force. Peppa pressed her back against the door, willing it to hold. Then, a slow, deliberate scratching at the wood. It was faint, methodical, like nails dragging just beneath the surface. A breathy whisper followed, an exhale too close, too deliberate. The shadows in the room began to shift, stretching along the walls in odd, angular shapes, pulsing as though the walls themselves were alive. The air grew colder still, wrapping around them like unseen fingers. Peppa felt her heart hammer against her ribs, her breath shallow and rapid. The house no longer felt like home. It had become something else, something dark, something watching, something waiting. And in the suffocating silence, Peppa knew they were not alone.
The day was damp and overcast. Rain had fallen since morning, and only by evening did it subside, leaving the yard filled with shining puddles and wet grass. Peppa and George ran outside, jumping in the puddles, laughing, building a little tower of stones. Everything seemed ordinary. Inside the house smelled of dinner, and from the kitchen came Mummy Pig's voice. But when the sun finally disappeared, a strange sound drifted from the forest. It wasn't barking, nor the creak of wind. Heavy, dragging breaths, as if something enormous was slowly moving between the trees. Peppa stopped and peered into the thicket. There, in the shadows, stood a tall figure. At first she thought it was a deer, but its steps were too slow, too heavy. Each hoofbeat sent a shudder through the ground. And then Peppa saw the eyes, red, burning like embers in the dark. Massive antlers tangled with branches, as if the forest itself had grown through the creature. "Peppa!" George whispered, clutching her hand. The figure took a step forward. The ground trembled. The children screamed and rushed to the house. Daddy Pig flung open the door and pulled them inside, quickly locking the bolts. In the same moment, the silhouette loomed over the windows, and the antlers scraped across the roof, leaving long scars. The house grew cold, the air thickened, the lamps flickered. In the glass appeared not their familiar reflections, but shadows with crimson eyes. Mummy Pig clutched George, and Peppa felt the walls were breathing, letting in strange sounds. The whisper of branches, the crack of bark. The monster did not leave. It slowly circled the house. Each step left deep hoof prints, and those prints seemed to echo inside as well. The floor shuddered, the walls groaned, the ceiling cracked. The house responded to every movement. Daddy Pig tried to draw the curtains, but the fabric clung to the glass. Beyond the window, there was no yard, only thicket, dense and endless. The moon broke through the branches, and between them, the red eyes flared again. The creature came closer. Its antlers struck the wall, and cracks spread through the wood. Shadows stretched out, forming shapes like hands. Peppa and George pressed themselves against their mother. "He won't leave," Peppa whispered. The monster loomed on every side. Its breath was heard everywhere, from beneath the floor, from the corridors, from the very roof. The air turned icy, and each breath came heavy, as if the house itself lived and breathed with it. In the living room, the light went out. In the darkness, only the eyes remained. They were outside and inside, seen in the windows, in the mirror, even in the black corners of the room. Daddy Pig grabbed the children's hands, but a step backward changed nothing. Behind them, the walls were no longer walls. Instead of wallpaper rose damp tree trunks, and roots pushed up through the floor. The house was turning into forest. Mummy Pig held George tight. Peppa clung to Daddy's hand. All four huddled in one corner, but corners no longer existed. The house dissolved, and the forest took its place. The whisper filled everything. It almost sounded like words, but none could be understood. Only one feeling remained. There was nowhere to go. The last thing the family saw was the creature's antlers breaking through the ceiling and its red eyes reflecting in every window at once. Since then, no one has seen the pig family. Their house still stands in the same place, but on rainy evenings it seems to merge with the forest. Inside it smells of resin and damp bark. Stains darken the walls, and pine cones lie in the corners. They say sometimes through the glass you can glimpse reflections, not just empty rooms, but red eyes, unblinking and cold. And in the thicket near the house, children's voices are heard, calling for help. The deer monster no longer returns to the forest. Now he is here, and he waits.